grim development in the case of the missing...
She's like, yes.
All we know, a real human being.
Clinton Speedy-Duroux was just 16 years old when they found his body, abandoned in the middle of nowhere, alone. His tiny body was discovered, dumped in the remote, quiet landscape of Bowraville, a small town tucked away in New South Wales, Australia. And just like that, the peace of this tight-knit community was shattered. The tragedy that would follow, no one could have foreseen. A town torn apart by 3 brutal murders. A story that would haunt Australia for decades, but the truth, it's still hidden. As you uncover the hidden truths with True Crime O'Clock, keep in mind, this is only the beginning. 3 children, 3 unspeakable deaths, 1 small town, and a mystery that still eludes us. What happened to Clinton, and why does the truth still haunt the shadows of Bowraville? Bowraville, a town once known for its peace, was about to be shaken to its core. The story doesn't begin with Clinton Speedy-Duroux alone. It began years earlier with the disappearance of a girl. Evelyn Greenup, just 4 years old, was the first to vanish without a trace. Evelyn was known for her kind heart and her bright spirit, a young girl full of life and promise, who had no reason to disappear. No warning signs. No one saw it coming. She simply vanished, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions. Her family, her friends, no one knew where she'd gone, but one thing was clear. Evelyn's disappearance was the beginning of something darker. Then in 1991 came Clinton Speedy-Duroux. Just 16 years old, Clinton was a bright, happy boy. His laughter echoed through the town, his innocence boundless. But Clinton's life was tragically cut short when his body was found, abandoned in a quiet part of town, like Evelyn's disappearance, with no answers, only pain. Clinton's death shattered the families, but there was more. Just 3 years later, Colleen Walker, only 16 years old, would disappear without a trace, just like Evelyn and Clinton her. Colleen Walker was a sweet, shy girl, loved by those who knew her. Her disappearance seemed to follow the same disturbing pattern as Evelyn's and Clinton's. Another innocent life stolen, another question unanswered, another name that would join the growing list of victims in Bowraville. 3 children, 3 unsolved disappearances. The town of Bowraville, once a quiet sanctuary, now buried under the weight of fear and suspicion. It became clear that something was terribly wrong here. But what? Could there be a connection between these 3 cases? Or was it just an unthinkable coincidence? As you dive deeper into the unsolved cases with True Crime O'Clock, the mystery that binds them together will become clearer and darker. Behind every disappearance, there's a story, a family shattered, a community forever changed. But for Bowraville, the chilling truth was still waiting, just out of reach. Jay Hart. His name became synonymous with the Bowraville Murders. But who was he? A quiet, unremarkable figure in a small town, or something far more dangerous? Jay Hart was no stranger to Bowraville. He had lived there for years, a familiar face to most of the townspeople. He was often seen in the company of children, a presence that seemed harmless to the untrained eye. But to those who began to look closer, there was something unsettling about his constant proximity to the victims. He had known Evelyn Greenup, Clinton Speedy-Duroux, and Colleen Walker. He was often around when the children were, and over time, suspicions began to form. Was it just coincidence? Or did he have a deeper connection to these disappearances? As the years passed and the investigation dragged on, Jay Hart's name kept surfacing. He had been in the area when Evelyn disappeared. He was seen near the spot where Clinton's body was found. And once again, when Colleen went missing, his presence was noted. It seemed as though Hart was always around when tragedy struck. And yet, despite these mounting connections, the investigation seemed to stall. Police failed to act, and Hart was never formally questioned. How could this be? Was there something the authorities were missing, or was it something else entirely? The townspeople began to grow frustrated. Questions started to rise. Why wasn't Hart brought in for questioning? Why had the police not pursued him further, despite the mounting suspicion? With no charges, no clear answers, and no action from the authorities, the investigation languished in the shadows. For years, Jay Hart seemed to evade any true scrutiny, even as the walls of suspicion closed in around him. The families of the victims, the mothers, the fathers, the siblings, had to live with the brutal reality that their children's killers were still out there, and the person they had suspected for so long remained free, untouched by the justice they so desperately sought. Despite the lack of action, the whispers never stopped. The people of Bowraville began to feel something they couldn't ignore. Justice was slipping through their fingers, and the town's darkest secrets were still hidden away.
Jay Hart may have evaded justice for now, but the mystery surrounding him and the truth about the Bowraville murders was far from over. Stay tuned as the story unfolds, and remember, the search for justice is only just beginning.
As the years stretched on, the investigation into the Bowraville murders ground to a halt. The leads that could have provided answers seemed to slip through the cracks. What should have been an urgent, thorough investigation became a slow, disjointed process. The town's anger grew, its frustration growing stronger. The police had the evidence, they had the testimonies. The connections to Jay Hart were undeniable. But despite this, the case went cold. No suspects, no arrests, no justice. The families of the victims were left with nothing but unanswered questions. They fought for answers, demanding that the police act. But time and time again, they were met with silence. As each year passed, it seemed the case mattered less and less. Clinton's mother, Leanne, would not rest. She pushed and pushed, refusing to let her son's memory fade. Evelyn's family continued their search for the truth. Colleen's mother, Sharon, stood outside police stations and government buildings, calling for justice. But their voices, it seemed, were ignored by those who had the power to act. How could this happen? Why had the investigation gone so wrong? Why was the town's grief so easily dismissed? Were the police unwilling to pursue Jay Hart? Or was something more suspicious at play? Questions like these plagued the town of Bowraville, and still the case languished in silence. Some believed the case was mishandled from the beginning. Critical evidence was overlooked. Leads were ignored. Witnesses were never fully questioned. The police didn't seem to have the urgency that was needed, something that would haunt the families for years. Was it the victims' backgrounds that caused the investigation to stall? After all, Bowraville was a small, tight-knit town, and the victims were from an Aboriginal community. Many felt that their children's lives didn't matter as much as others. Was there a deeper hidden prejudice, or was it simply incompetence at the highest levels?
Every passing year made the pain worse. For the families, every day without answers felt like a betrayal. And yet, no one in authority seemed to take it seriously. The case seemed to slip through the cracks of the justice system, slipping further and further into the shadows.
But despite the silence from the police, the families would not give up. They refused to let the memory of their children fade. They would continue to push for justice, even if no one was listening. This was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The Bowraville murders had not been solved, but they hadn't been forgotten either. The search for justice was far from over. Years had passed, and for many, the Bowraville murders were fading into history. But as time wore on, the whispers of injustice grew louder. A growing outcry emerged from the families, the Aboriginal community, and the media. They wouldn't let the case be forgotten. The victims' families refused to remain silent. Evelyn's family, Clinton's mother, and Colleen's loved ones, all of them year after year calling for answers. Their relentless fight for justice soon began to catch the attention of the media. The case that had once been ignored was now front and center in newsrooms across Australia.
The media spotlight on Bowraville grew brighter, and the case was reignited. As the public pressure mounted, the story reached the ears of politicians, local officials, and the people who had the power to take action. The truth, it seemed, was finally being heard. With the media's involvement came renewed hope that the long-forgotten case might finally see the justice it deserved. In 2015, after years of silence, the breakthrough the families had been waiting for arrived. Jay Hart, the man who had been at the center of suspicion for so long, was arrested. After years of growing frustration, the authorities finally made their move. The town, the families, the media, everyone who had pushed for justice now held their breath.
hoping that the arrest of Jay Hart would bring them closer to the truth. But for the families, the emotions were complicated. There was hope, but there was also doubt. After all these years, would this arrest lead to real answers? Was Jay Hart truly the killer? Or was there more to this story than anyone could imagine? For years, the families had lived with the uncertainty, their grief compounded by the unanswered questions. Now, with Hart in custody, the sense of justice seemed within reach. But was it possible to ever truly know the truth? The arrest was a powerful moment, but it was only the beginning of the next chapter. The question remained: would the case finally be solved? Would justice be served? The Bowraville murders had come back into the spotlight, but the final act of this haunting story was yet to unfold. With Jay Hart's arrest, the families of Bowraville began to feel a flicker of hope. The moment they had waited for was finally within reach, an end to the years of unanswered questions. But as the trial loomed, the sense of justice was not as certain as it appeared. The nation watched as the trial began. The evidence against Hart was compelling. Witness testimonies, DNA evidence, and the undeniable connections between him and the victims. For the first time in decades, it seemed that justice might finally prevail. But as the case unfolded, cracks began to appear. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They claimed that there was not enough to definitively prove Jay Hart's guilt. What seemed like a straightforward case started to unravel piece by piece. Despite the evidence, the trial faltered. The prosecution struggled to present a case that would hold up in the face of aggressive defense tactics. Key witnesses wavered, critical pieces of evidence were challenged. What seemed like an open and shut case now looked uncertain. The longer the trial went on, the more the weight of doubt hung over it. Could Jay Hart really be guilty? Or had the case against him been built on shaky ground? The families of the victims, who had fought for so long, now found themselves at the mercy of a legal system that seemed to be failing them once again. And then the unthinkable happened. In 2017, after months of testimony, the trial collapsed. The charges against Jay Hart were dropped. The evidence, it seemed, wasn't enough. The case that had consumed the town of Bowraville for so long faltered. The families were crushed. Their fight for justice, their hopes for closure were shattered in an instant. The years of waiting, of hoping, had led to this moment of devastating defeat. For the people of Bowraville, the trial's collapse felt like a betrayal, a cruel twist of fate that saw the alleged murderer slip through their fingers once again. Jay Hart walked free, and the truth once again remained elusive. Despite the crushing blow, the families refused to give up. Their pain only deepened, but their resolve grew stronger. The truth was still out there, but would it ever be brought to light? The story of Bowraville was far from over. The fight for justice was still burning in the hearts of those who refused to forget. But for now, the case was dead. At least, for the moment. For the families of Evelyn, Clinton, and Colleen, the fight for justice never stopped. Despite the heartbreak of the trial's collapse, despite the years of silence, they refused to give up. Their hearts remained heavy with the pain of lost children, but their resolve remained unbroken. For years, the case sat dormant, cold. But even in the darkness, new hope began to emerge. Advances in forensic science, the very technology that had failed to solve the case for so long, was finally being applied to the Bowraville murders. In 2020, new forensic methods were used to re-examine old evidence, DNA testing, advanced technology. The cold case files were reopened, and for the first time in years, the glimmer of hope returned. New leads emerged from the past, new evidence that had been missed in previous investigations. The town of Bowraville felt a spark of hope. Could this finally be the moment they had all been waiting for? Was the truth about to come to light? The case was no longer forgotten, it was no longer dormant. For the first time in years, the families felt that justice could still be within reach. But the question remained, would this new evidence be enough? Could this technology truly unravel the truth that had eluded them for so long? Even as the investigation took new steps forward, the uncertainty remained. Jay Hart's role in the murders was still not fully confirmed. Could he truly be the killer? Or was there someone else still out there living among them? The possibility of closure seemed tantalizing, yet distant. The fight for justice continued. The families had never stopped, and now, with these new forensic advances, they felt as though they were finally on the cusp of uncovering the truth. But the journey was far from over. The Bowraville murders remain unsolved, but as long as the families breathe, as long as the community stands united, the search for justice will continue, because no matter how long it takes, the truth will eventually come to light. For now, we wait, we remember, and we fight for the truth that still hides in the shadows of Bowraville. The Bowraville murders remain unsolved. 3 children, 3 brutal murders, and a town forever changed. The families of Evelyn, Clinton, and Colleen, despite years of heartbreak and frustration, still fight for the truth that has eluded them for so long. Through decades of pain, through setbacks and defeats, they have never given up. Their fight for justice continues, and with each new breakthrough, each new lead, their hope is rekindled. Even after years of silence, the truth is not forgotten. The Bowraville murders may have been buried in the shadows for too long, but the fight for justice is far from over. It's a fight carried by the families, by the people of Bowraville, by all those who believe that no child's death should ever go unanswered.
We remember their names, we remember their lives, and we will continue to wait for the truth that still hides in the shadows of Bowraville.
If you believe that justice should always be sought, join True Crime O'Clock. Subscribe now and follow the search for truth in this case and others like it. The fight for justice never ends.